Grace to you and peace from God, our Creator, our Redeemer, and our Sustainer. My name is Lori Tiberi. I am the interim pastor here at this congregation, and on behalf of the session and the congregation, I welcome you all to this service of the celebration of the life of the Reverend Bruce Billman. I want to thank the Reverends Ray Bagnuolo, Janie Spar, and Lisa Largis for all of the work that they did in planning this service and in gathering all these wonderful photographs and other items from Bruce's life that you are invited to come and look at the end of the service. And now, let us worship God.
Let us pray together. I want this to be a place where we can touch and be touched by the utterly, the unmistakably sacred, the breath in all breathing, the light in all seeing, the fire in every righteous anger, the resonance in deep silence, the love which graces and ennobles all loves, the hospitality which bids a welcome to each of our returnings and grieves a little at each of our leavings. The unmistakably sacred which precedes all of our singing, the sighing which, when we are awake, calls us home to ourselves, where in our blood and bones the body of God dwells. This is such a place where God and Goddess, Bruce and the great cloud of witnesses unite in this celebration we share together, a celebration of gratitude and love as we remember friend and rascal, the Reverend Bruce E. Billman. Amen.
Good morning. I'm Sandy Morales, and I served as Bruce's deacon. I'm very thankful to have known him. It was a joy to know Bruce. And I'm going to read Matthew 17, 1 through 18. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on a high mountain to be alone with them. And before their eyes, Jesus was transfigured, his face becoming as dazzling as the sun, and his clothes as radiant as light. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with Jesus. Then Peter said, "Rabbi, how good that we are here. With your permission, I will erect 3 shelters here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter was still speaking when suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. Out of the cloud came a voice which said, "This is my own, my beloved, on whom my favor rests. Listen to this one." When they heard this, the disciples fell forward on the ground, overcome with fear. Jesus came toward them and touched them, saying, "Get up, don't be afraid." When they looked up, they did not see anyone but Jesus. This ends the reading.
Good morning. Good morning. And good morning to Bruce Billman. We hope so much, we know you are listening in at this time. So welcome, Bruce. We welcome you to listen in to how we love you and who you are to us. Well, Bruce rose every morning before dawn, and he had his favorite coffee shops. And everyone that he went into, if any of you were with him, they would say, "Well, good morning, Bruce," because he was their favorite customer, no matter what coffee shop we went into. And having breakfast with Bruce, he always had his leather cap, which adorned his bald head. And we would go in, and it was so fun and so hilarious. You know, he would lean over as though he were going to tell you a secret. Like this. He would lean over, and then he would tell us some hilarious story, and the whole coffee shop was laughing with us. Bruce gave wings to the LGBTQ liberation movement. He shared his coming out story with 2 significant people that changed our lives. One was Sylvia Thorson Smith, when he served as the assistant pastor in Wichita, Kansas. And the latter one was Virginia West Davidson. Don't we know that name? And while he served as assistant pastor here at the downtown church, the Davidson family adopted him. And it was Davy and Ginny, and it was their 4 children, Jim, John, Nell, and Peter. And I can tell you now, today, Jim and Mary Davidson are here with us. And we're so glad. We feel so close to both Bruce and your mom. So one afternoon, as we know the story, Bruce was waiting for Ginny in her driveway at East Avenue. She thought, well, that's interesting. But Bruce, of course, helped her bring in the groceries. And then they sat in the living room, and Bruce told his coming out story. In hearing Bruce's story and the acceptance by his dearest friends, he understood his own transfiguration, which in turn transformed every listener into action. This acceptance opened Bruce to a new freedom of loving who he was and sprung these friends into true advocacy. Yes, Bruce's story ignited Ginny into becoming not only a great ally and advocate, but she served as the moderator, the vice moderator of the General Assembly, and then became chair of the task force called Church and the Homosexual. This piece of work went to thousands and thousands of people, and it was really a biblical, theological, psychological piece that was beautiful, which then ended with our stories. For 2 years, they traveled the country listening to LGBTQ people. Bruce, knowing Ginny's thorough way, and any of us who know Ginny, her discipline and how she would do things, and she would say, for instance, when I would do the dishwasher or fill it, she'd go, "Not that I'm fussy, dear." You know. So imagine that if it was a dish, imagine how she was with scholarship. So this scholarship opened our denomination for change. It was really when she went to the assembly, and there's a picture right down here. He had a picture created for her, and it says this. She was known as the Turtle Woman to him, and he wrote this: "You don't get things done if you don't stick out your neck." And heavens knows she did. Bruce loved this church. He loved the downtown church. He loved South Church, and he was chaplain at the Presbyterian home. He was also an excellent counselor and therapist. He counseled many through their addictions, prisons, terms, also life-threatening illness. He opened his home to many people who were lost. And I don't know if people knew that. He would literally take them in because he saw in them something that other people finally saw in him. And he opened his door. Many stayed with him through all their addictions, through their prison terms. He had scores of friends. They not only loved him, both old and young, but what they loved about him was not only his sense of humor, which we all loved, but they loved his compassionate heart because they knew they would be heard. He loved animals, especially his ferocious dog, Molly, if any of you knew Molly. He loved Thelma and Louise. He loved when Ginny and I were named Thelma and Louise. He said, "Actually, Janie, they're forgetting a third person." And he said, "There is a triumvirate." And I said, "All right, let's hear it, Bruce." And he said, "Well, it's Thelma, Louise, and Brute." He called himself Brute. He served on the board of that All May Freely Serve, and not only was it his humor, it was his loyalty. It was his insights that he brought to every meeting and to every retreat. He loved preaching, and there were 2 special sermons. One was Night of the Iguana, and the other was Chocolat. So June and I traveled to France to the town Flavigny-sur-Ozeraine. How did you like that? I practiced that quite a bit. We traveled to France, and we went to that town, and we got some wonderful things for him, including chocolat. We actually went into it, had become a store, and we went in there and brought him back some things. Can you imagine his face when we arrived with little trinkets and chocolat? He always reminded us that life is a movie. We are so grateful, Bruce, that you chose us to be in your movie. Thank you for producing an award-winning film, for you have transformed us all. Blessed be.
You know, it doesn't feel like a sad occasion. It feels like a holy occasion, and I'm just so glad to be here with each one of you and with Janie and Ray, and especially all of you who loved Bruce so well and took such good care of him and honored who he was. Jim Tiefenthal is going to be reading the poem later on that comes at the end of Night of the Iguana. And in the movie, Nono has been struggling with this poem all of his life, and it's his great summing up. And the poem's about a golden leaf browning and breaking and falling to earth. And it's based on a poem that Tennessee Williams wrote earlier in his life. And in that poem, Nono refers to those leaves still on the tree but changed from their summer green as beings of a golden kind. And they are everywhere. Everywhere and everyone, each of us and all of us, beings of a golden kind. But most of us, most of the time, miss the glimmer and the dazzle, the sheen, the sparkle. Peter and James and John caught onto it when they were on the mountain and Jesus started glowing. And what's more, they heard it. They heard the voice from the holy universe say, "This dazzling one is my beloved." And Bruce, dear one, I hope you heard it. I hope you were enveloped by that glow and felt that beautiful vibration deep down in your soul telling you, "You, O dazzling one, are my beloved." I hope you heard it, Bruce, and felt it and knew it because you were forever pointing it out to us. I think that's why you love that mosaic here at the downtown church of the Transfiguration. I think it's why you love the movies and the opera and all things packed with dazzle and light and spark and wit and sensuality and sex and sizzle and beauty. We are all beings of a golden kind. It's what you knew, it's what you believed, and it's what you wanted us to understand. And I hope you knew it for yourself too, Bruce, because you were so far out in front, and that takes a toll. The lies were strong back then. This was the 60s, for goodness sakes, when Bruce first came out to Sylvia and then to Ginny. And the voices countering them, the voices countering those lies were few. It was the lie of sickness, the lie of sin, the lie that you were bad or broken. And I think, Bruce, that all of that must have hurt you in some way. But I don't know, because you didn't talk about the things that hurt you. And I wonder if this is what happened for Bruce. Bruce, you came out in this world with your soul so finely attuned to all that is beautiful and your spirit alive to the spark in everything. And when you were still a young man, in a world that denied and denigrated that which was precious in you, nonetheless, you had the courage and the self-possession and the wisdom to name who you were, to say, "I am a gay man." And I wonder if that mashup of being out and queer in a world where it wasn't in any way safe to be out and wasn't in any way all right to be queer, produced that singular way of understanding the world that was Bruce's. I mean, I'm wondering if that's what made Bruce so belovedly and so Bruce-ishly quirky. Because I think when you're so out in front like that, that experience can make you jaded or cynical or withdrawn or just baseline angry. But for Bruce, I think it gave him a perspective on the world which was just delightfully and deliberately off-kilter. There is a slant to everything, a quirkiness at the core, a sly smile in the heart of the universe. And Bruce knew all about that. There is a silliness in the seriousness, and always there was a seriousness in Bruce's silly. You are one of God's critters, Mr. Bruce E. Billman, and there is a place for you in the choir. Thank you for shaking your tambourine with us. Thank you for cherishing the beautiful and the dazzle, the queer and the quirky in all of us. Say thank you. You are now and forever a being of a golden kind. We love you, Bruce.
Well, good morning. It is not for the faint of heart to follow Janie Spar and Lisa Largess, but you're with me, and I'm with you. And it is really wonderful to be with you and to see so many friends here this morning. With you, I'm thinking about our friend Bruce this morning, of course, and with you, I think about how much I loved him. I'm never quite comfortable putting that in the past tense. It continues, and that he loved us. I think of so many of you who were with him at different times during the last several years of his health, his mostly declining health, and how during that time, his heart and his fondness for all of you only grew. Your cards, your visits, your prayers, the memories he held of you, he held on to them more deeply as his world became a bit smaller, his mobility much less, but his heart and his fondness of you, this congregation, this church, only grew. And I want to especially thank somebody with a huge heart, you already know this, Jim Tiefenthal, who became Bruce's very much closest friend. He became a confidant, an advocate, a mover of Bruce from place to place and place to place again, a keeper and emptier of storage units, while navigating the social services and Medicaid services with residences, nursing homes, and hospitals. Jim, personally and collectively, we thank you from deeply within for caring and for caring for our friend. We love you. And to everyone here, yes. That just ended the frozen chosen myth. Okay, good. And to everyone here who helped with this celebration of Bruce's life, to Pastor Lori, and again to Jim, especially Pastor Lori and Jim, who shared, I like to think of it as sharing Bruce's ashes in the garden of this church outside earlier this week with the blessing of the leadership of this church. Thank you, Pastor Lori, Lee Wright, Alan Jones, Joan Mackey, and Carol Snook, the co-chairs of the deacons, to Dave and Don up there. Hello, Dave and Don. For sending this far and wide, and so that those who can't be here today and those who wish to can watch again and again. to Penny Crudup and Teresa Ward, to the staff of this loving congregation, to Pat Youngdahl, whose visits to Bruce meant a great deal, and especially to Bruce's deacon, Sandy Morales. Sandy, you were wonderful to Bruce, always there, always available to her. You were a bringer of joy and comfort to Bruce, and thank you. Thank you. And I think of Bruce's transfiguration and transformation. You've heard the stories. But it's in the light and the fire and the warmth of that transfiguration. It's within there that a courage and a conviction spurred within Bruce for freedom and for justice and for joy in expanding into the world, exploding into the world. Hope for marginalized communities, queer communities, for people who God created us to be, who were being held back from being. And it still happens. We do it one heart at a time, one person at a time if we must. But we do it, and it grows. And if that's what it took, that's what this congregation has always done, especially in the ministries that you have developed and grown out of your faithfulness and your convictions and courage. You, downtown, I don't want to say it wrong, Downtown United Presbyterian Church. It still rolls off my tongue. But Downtown Church, you loved around this country and this community for many, many things. But one thing that the national denomination and other denominations and the queer community and people who love them and the allies of our community, that all may freely serve, will forever be what grew from here out of that courage and conviction, sending Janie and then Lisa and many of us out into the world. And still today, remembering who you are, because we remember who Bruce is, and we remember the others who have gone before, and you know these things deeply in your hearts. I want to say three things before I close. Bruce loved Gary Carlin. Bruce loved Gary Carlin. And when Gary suddenly died, he preceded Bruce in death by a couple of years. When he suddenly died, that sorrow was intensely felt in Bruce, felt as much as the truest sense of the human condition permits that, while allowing us to continue in our life. I want to thank Gary for the love and the friendship that he brought to Bruce. And then, in these programs that are on the table in the front, from Rock Stars and Prophets, Heart and Soul, a conference we had a while back where many of you were there or heard about. In here, there's a little bit about Bruce. And towards the bottom, he says, towards the end of this, he says, I came out to Virginia Davidson in about 1969. Sylvia Thorson Smith and Brother Christopher with the Teze brothers in Pine Mountain were there. When I told Brother Christopher I was gay and a minister, and I loved Christ, in answer to his question, how are you, Bruce? I'm gay, I'm a minister, I love Christ. Brother Christopher says, I know you love Christ. He shines on your face. Bruce loved being a minister. He loved serving you and others. And he loved Christ. Whether the Christ we know in our hearts is the one clearly defined, or the one, some say, is more than Jesus. He loved Christ, his ministry, and you. And the transformation In one of the versions of the Transformation, there is a young boy down in the bottom looking up. Bruce always talked about this. He said, "You see that small boy in some of those pictures?" I said, "Yep." He said, "That's me." He says, "That's me looking up to God." Well, friends, as he did looking up to God, looking up to Christ, serving in the ministry he loved, because he loved Christ and because he loved us, his centering on that transforming love gave him courage and peace in his final days. He was ready, and he is ready. And so, Bruce, now we look up and around to you. We see you in one another and in the power of God's love in all the ways that we know God. And in all the choir, with all the critters, we clap our hands and we clap our paws and everything we got now. And we say, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, God. Thank you for your love and this man's life that we celebrate today. Thank you.
All God's critters got a place in the choir. Some sing low, some sing high, some sing out loud on the telephone wire. And some just clap their hands or pause for anything they got now. Listen to the bass, it's a one on the bottom where the bullfrog croaks and the hippopotamus moans and groans with a big to-do, and the old cow just goes.
Well, the dogs and the cats, they take up the middle. The honeybee hums and the crickets fiddle. The donkey brays and the pony neighs. The old coyote,
All God's critters got a place in the choir. Some sing low and some sing high. Some sing out loud on the telephone wire. And some just clap their hands or pause for anything they got now. Listen to the top where the little birds sing and the melodies with the high notes ring. The hoot owl hollers over everything and a jaybird disagrees.
singing in the nighttime, singing in the day. The little duck quacks and he's on his way. The possum don't have much to say. The porcupine talks to herself.
Everybody here is a part of the plan. All get to play in the great critter band. From the eagle in the sky and the whale in the sea, it's one great symphony. All God's critters got a place in the choir. Some sing low and some sing higher. Some sing out loud on the telephone wire. And some just clap their hands, applause for anything they got now.
They got now.
So we have some time now for some of you who would like to come forward and say a few words. If you would like to do that, you're invited to use the microphone on the floor, or you could use this one too, but if you'd rather not navigate the steps, both of them are live. You don't have to touch them or do anything. So if you'd like to come forward, this would be the time. You're invited to do so. Doug?
Complex carbohydrates. We've heard a lot this morning about what was dear and near to Bruce, but I can tell you this was Bruce's nemesis. I was honored to be Bruce's physician for a number of years before his decline, and I can tell you he battled mightily against the evils of the complex carbohydrates. With his faithful nutritionist, Stella, he waged war on cookies, cakes, pasta, and pies. There were victories, but there were many defeats. Nonetheless, he always fought on with good humor. Now, in medical offices, they often say, everyone brings joy to the office. Some, when they enter. And Bruce was clearly one of those. He always seemed more interested to hear about Greg and I and our pets than to talk about his own needs, and was somewhat of a pastor to me when he came for my services. On those occasions when we found, shall we say, more of Bruce to love, he would cite lost battles with the complex carbohydrate to explain and to vow to fight on. Now, there were some choices that Bruce made through the years that seemed a bit concerning, but did he not model our brother Jesus the Christ in all of his life? Today, we're here to say thank you for being our friend. Thank you for your witness to the wildly inclusive love of God. But now, speaking of cookies, don't you think he'd be a little disappointed that there aren't any on offer after his service? Mind you, not that he'd have any of them himself.
Sit here. You all know me as Mary Reese, but Bruce knew me as Mrs. Wonderful. A name I love and love. The first year that Jim and I had Bruce over for Christmas Eve dinner prior to coming to the service, we introduced him to two of our traditions, one of them eggnogs, which we had a lot of fun joking about, and the second was a doll, a male doll we have, whose name is Mr. Wonderful. I don't know if any of you remember seeing Mr. Wonderful around. There was a Mrs. Wonderful too, but she wasn't nearly as funny. What happens with Mr. Wonderful is you push a little button and he says things like, "I'm lost. I think I'll stop and ask directions." Or he might say, "Oh, your mother's coming to visit? Let's see if she'll stay a week." Anyway, from that moment on, our names became Mr. and Mrs. Wonderful to Bruce, and every time I would see him or when I would go visit him, he'd say, and how is Mr. Wonderful? I think for me, this was just one of the many examples of how Bruce could make anything fun, and of his truly affectionate nature, and the love that he shared with everyone through his fun and through his way of loving. I have the honor today to bring to you some words from Sylvia Thorson Smith. And there's a picture of her here with Bruce and Virginia, if you don't know who she is. Many of us knew her through her work nationally in the Presbyterian denomination around feminist issues, feminist theology, and all kinds of justice issues, and particularly working with the Voices of Sophia, which some of you may recall. Sylvia sent some words that she wrote many years ago in a book called Called Out With, about Bruce. I started to earn a graduate degree in sociology and women's studies. I read feminist theology and grew stronger in my conviction that the God of the Bible creates both women and men in the divine image, denounces all manner of injustice, breaks down barriers, and opens the way to freedom. I saw the face of feminism in many people who supported my journey, but I cherish one very special person, a minister named Bruce, who widened my vision and turned me in the direction of those whom I'd previously not seen or known. To my amazement, this clergyman understood the grip of sexism on the church, interpreted the Bible in new and liberating ways, preached sermons on texts about women, and even talked about sexuality from the pulpit. I loved him for what he gave me as a person and as a woman, a sense of dignity, respect, and value. But he gave me much more than that. He gave me his trust and the revelation that he was gay. With the gift of his own identity, Bruce provided me with one of the most valuable insights about the connections I had been making. He gave me the beginning of an awareness that we can best know who we are and whose we are when we recognize and affirm the diversity of God's good gift of human sexuality. Bruce gave me one more priceless gift, an introduction to his good friend, Virginia Davidson from Rochester, New York. Jenny spoke at our church in Wichita when she was vice moderator of the General Assembly, and our friendship deepened over the years through mutual advocacy of women's issues in the church. When she chaired the General Assembly Task Force on Homosexuality in 1976-78, Virginia Davidson became, for me, the face of courage, caring, and faithfulness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. For 20 years, she has been a model of what it means to be a heterosexual ally in solidarity with gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered people. And then Sylvia added, "Please tell people that I loved Bruce Billman for almost 50 years. And he literally changed my life, being the first one to person a different identity and way of being to me. We had so much fun together. He was one of the funniest people I have ever known." I agree.
I think we're going to see some continuity of theme here, because I want to start with dessert. I have written here, I realize that's a little odd, but it obviously isn't. We know what's going on. My mom, Jenny Davidson, was a pretty good cook before she began moderating in the Presbyterian higher elevations. Pretty good cook all around, but she was especially mean-handed when it came to desserts. When she had a dinner party, she did not stint. She knew different people had different favorites, as she always provided a choice. In late spring, her rhubarb pies were pretty good, but she would offer a contrast, perhaps her California sour cream cheesecake. And so Dad, who was the impresario at the dining room table, would get up after the main course and lay out the choices for dessert. Now, back in those days, Bruce often dined with us, especially on the weekend, and especially if he was suffering through the agonies of getting a sermon together for the next morning. Nothing better than a home-cooked meal to inspire you a little bit. And so Dad would get around to the table taking dessert orders, this guest choosing the rhubarb pie, that guest going for the brownie special, and then he'd get to Bruce, where he usually would find a mischievous little grin waiting for him, followed by two simple words: "Yes, please." Well, of course. Why would you limit yourself to one dessert when the choices were so spectacular? Why go for half measures? Bruce was very often that way with desserts, and very often that way with life. I remember him when he was in charge of the junior high Sunday school division back around 1960. Not an easy task when all of us kids wanted to be cool, and you had to please them while remaining within the confines of a church that was, back in those days, a little more staid and straight than today's approach to celebrating the Word. I do remember having him have us junior hires over to his apartment and playing the soundtrack from West Side Story, which was pretty cool. I can, on the other hand, also recall the title of this theatrical comedy we students were asked to perform one year. The title was "If Girls Asked Boys for Dates." In 1960, that seemed at least vaguely unconventional. Bruce was a good sport about junior high, but he was much more unconventional in the sermons he gave, as we've already heard a little bit. He wanted to challenge his parishioners, and often he did so by discussing controversial movies. In particular, I recall a sermon we've already heard from Janie about, the Night of the Iguana. To apply the old minister's saw, while Bruce was always ready to comfort the afflicted, he was even more ready to afflict the comfortable, given his fairly prosperous congregation. He did so always in a spirit of love, sharing as someone who knew he was very much like them. Williams' play told the story of a down-and-out minister left the church in disgrace and was now in exile, so to speak, in Mexico. The iguana of the title is a lizard who is kept by boys tied up with a rope, and the minister, too, feels tied up, at least at the end of his own rope, so to speak. It was only some years later that we learned that Bruce was laboring with his own constraints, held by a similar rope, you might say, by being forced to live closeted in a straight world and having to spread the gospel of love to a congregation from which some of his deepest love had to be hidden, lest he be shunned and out of a job. As for so many of that era, the task of cutting the rope, of coming out of the closet, was an act of bravery, of honesty, of witness, and of love. That was a central part of Bruce's long journey. It was a journey he always undertook with goodwill and compassion for everyone he knew, and he opened the eyes of so many in the congregation, as well as myself. I know he did that for me, and also for our family, as you've heard. And you've heard the way my mom sort of made it a major part of her life's work. to spread the gospel of diversity and love. As for Bruce's spiritual devotion, that was so clear. He was yes, please, all the way. My brother John in Paris wrote me recently about that devotion, which for Bruce so often expressed itself in song. John was the only one of we 4 siblings who followed my father's avocation in learning to play the organ, a task that brought John into contact with Bruce and music. To quote my brother, the Taizé community in Burgundy, France attracted Bruce, and in particular, the monks' songs and the simplicity of the monks' lives. As my organ skills were growing, the two of us often went into Taylor Chapel, where incidentally, our parents were married. Bruce gave me a book of psalms set to Taizé music, and he simply sang them while I played. It can't have been after church because Bruce would have been busy with coffee hour then in the Halleck Lounge. But during the week, when I came in to practice, Bruce heard me playing and joined me in the chapel to sing his heart out. Bruce had quite a voice for singing and loved using it that way. And that was so true. As all of you know who have heard him sing, that strong tenor voice was unlike any other I have heard. And Bruce was not shy about projecting it. For him, God was clearly in the glory of song. And as Bruce walked out down the aisle at the end of the service, he held his head high and his hymnal straight before him, and you heard that voice reverberate through the sanctuary. He's on his last recessional now, and though we cannot know the exact end point of the journey, I think we can take a pretty good guess. Impossible to say who might be on duty at the gates. There's probably a rotation due to much fairer labor laws up there. So it could be Peter, Mary Magdalene, or John the Baptist. Whoever, they would send the word on high. A fellow named Billman, he's offering to sing All Things Bright and Beautiful or a Taizé psalm. And surely that voice on high from out of the clouds will echo back a simple answer. Billman, yes, please. And so say we all.
I don't quite know how to put what I'm thinking into words, other than to say how deeply what everybody has said has touched me, and also set off some thoughts about the power of what Bruce did when he told Ginny and Sylvia that he was gay. Over my lifetime, I've done a lot of reading about early Christianity and trying to perhaps answer the question once I learned what the early church was really like, what happened. I guess I would say that the true, what Christianity is, was put in the closet. And I guess my thought has to do with how Bruce's life is a metaphor for the coming out of the entire church. Amen.
These words come to us from our dear friends and Bruce's dear friends, Gail and Tony Ricciuti. When we think of our friend Bruce, we unfailingly are led to think of the skin horse in the Velveteen Rabbit, whose motto he so treasured and lived by. It was almost a mantra for Bruce, who could recite it word for word, and it became a kind of gift for any and all who took the time to sit at Bruce's feet, so to speak. It goes like this. Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But those things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. We believe it was Bruce's life philosophy for two reasons. Because he himself knew at some level that he was real. Because we all really loved him, and because he really loved all of us, with whom he worked, played, laughed, cried, and frolicked throughout his life. He loved us real too. For all of this, we will remember and treasure him always. Gail and Tony.
I think we have time for one or two more if anybody else wanted to speak.
Doug's words referring to the complex carbohydrates reminds me in 1980, new to Rochester, right out of college, meeting Bruce on Culver Road at the early meetings of Presbyterians for Gay Concerns. And as Janie has talked about, how we might fully integrate our lives, that was something I was struggling with at the time. And so I was working at Xerox, and we would have these monthly potlucks. And not being very good at making cakes like Jenny and wonderful desserts, which I knew Bruce loved, I would stop by Kentucky Fried Chicken and pick up a big barrel of chicken. Well, Bruce, I think, felt for me my sense of, not inadequacy in terms of the culinary arts and so forth, and he would opine about how wonderful it was to partake of body parts. So at first I wasn't really sure how to take it. I wanted to see, what is Bruce really getting at? And with Bruce, you had to really listen, and it's sort of like making soup, where you really need to let it steep for a couple of days, for a long time, and let all the juices kind of get to know each other. But I think what I got out of that was how we can be fully embodied. We are not just spirit. We are human beings. We are fully sexual. We are fully, what Lisa referred to, about we're golden. I mean, it's like our body is a temple. And Bruce was, in very simple words, which were preponderant, it made you really ponder, what the heck is he talking about? that's what I ultimately got out of it. And it was a pastoral piece, for me personally. And those gatherings, which were so important. Here was the sanctuary within the church. We all need safe places within, wherever we are, but especially in the church, because there can be so much hurt. Going to general assemblies and whatnot, and even going to synod, we need sanctuaries. So as when we work on anti-racism and other things, we need to provide sanctuary. And that's one of the reasons why I love this church, because you provide sanctuary in what you do. Bruce also really moved us into action. I was kind of shy because I was really trying to figure out, can one integrate their sexuality and their spirituality in the church? And that group formed Create Justice at the urging of Jim Rice. Someone remembered Jim Rice on staff of the Presbytery. And he, with the major fundraising for the denomination, and 1/3 of that fundraising would stay locally for innovative programming, innovative ministries, new things. And he encouraged us to take that little piece from the Church on Homosexuality recommendations, which were all awful, because the minority became the majority, and majority recommendation became the minority in 1978. There was this one little root of Jesse, which talked about the church affirms the civil rights of all people. So that little group, with Bruce's urging and with Jenny's support and the kind of bravery of that little group, we applied for funds to start what became the first civil rights advocacy network, ecumenical civil rights advocacy network in upstate New York in the early 80s. And part of how we got it approved was, well, of course, everybody's going to be nervous. So we're going to report every 6 months to the Presbytery. And the Presbytery said, well, of course, we have to have oversight. What we wanted to do was to tell stories. The only thing is, in our little group, we weren't sure who was going to be telling a story. Bruce, and I was like terrified, Bruce said, well, Ralph, if you'll tell your story, some of your story. Now, mind you, I had not come out to any of the pastors at Third Church at that point. I was like terrified. And he said, but if you'll tell your story, I'll lead a Bible study for the Presbytery. And it was held at First Church, Pittsford. So Bruce's little simple idea then says, okay, you got to do this. You're not out at work. You're not out with anybody. He said, but I am behind you all the way. And that's the way Bruce was. And his spirit does that even now. He is among us. Kay Wroblewski, Lily Jules, Margaret Stoltman, these saints of the church. And Bruce is there, and he's singing, and he's dancing in heaven. God bless Bruce Billman.
No one else would like to come forward, then I'll invite Jim to come up and read the poem.
So after I heard Bruce give more than one sermon referencing chocolat, of course I had to get the movie and look at it, which I did. And the protagonist reminds me of Janie Sparr. This is a woman newly arriving to town. It's a small French village. It's 1959. Let's just say she's more flamboyant than the usual villager. It's just before Lent, and she opens a chocolate shop directly across the square from the church, thus poking fingers into the staid religion of the town. But by Easter, she's won everyone over to her point of view. I've heard Bruce mention Night of the Iguana more than any other film, and of course we had to have lunch at the Silver Iguana, a tapas bar on North Winton Road here in Rochester. The server lit up Bruce's gaydar. And it was my privilege to watch the 1964 movie with him relatively recently at the Dryden, a 500-seat film preservation cinema here in town. And I said, let me guess, Bruce, you like this movie so much because the protagonist is named Shannon, just like your grandmother. He said, well, yeah, that's part of it, but really it's because it's about a man at the end of his rope. As the movie opens, the Reverend T. Lawrence Shannon is kicked out of his congregation, and he takes a cut-rate job at a travel agency guiding middle-aged women through Mexico. Essentially, he hijacks the bus to a very rural inn in Mismaloya on the West Coast. And the innkeeper there is Maxine, with whom he's been long acquainted. Now, many of the characters are also at the end of their rope. Maxine has just lost her husband, who did much of the work at the inn, and therefore the business is struggling. Hannah arrives with her grandfather separately, and they're desperately poor. Judith is struggling with her identity, and the iguana is tied up. So the poem occurs near the end of the movie, which provides a transition point in the plot to resolve some of the plot lines. And in my mind, everyone gets what they need at the end of the movie, including the iguana. So I'm convinced that when Bruce thinks of the poem and the broader movie, he thinks of the love that all of you gave him. So here's Nano's last poem. How calmly does the olive branch observe the sky begin to blanch, without a cry, without a prayer, with no betrayal of despair. Sometime, while the night obscures the tree, the zenith of its life will be gone, past forever, and from thence, a second history will commence. A chronicle no longer gold, a bargaining with mist and mold. And finally, the broken stem plummeting to earth, and then an intercourse not well designed for beings of a golden kind, whose native green must arch above the earth's obscure, corrupting love. And still, the ripe fruit of the branch, observe the sky begin to blanch, without a cry, without a prayer, with no betrayal of despair. Oh, courage! Could you not as well select a second place to dwell? Not only in that golden tree, but in the frightened heart of me.
So two small bits of things. One, Bruce would be terribly upset if I didn't bring your attention to the front of your bulletin, where it says his birth date, April 4th, 1934. He would remind us often that was the same birthday as Bridget Bardot, and his eyes were of the same color. And then the second thing, my apologies. A friend once told me it's a sign of clearing up, Ray, when you call people, places, and things by their right names. And on the back of here, it does say Downtown Presbyterian Church. So that's the name, and I'm sorry I muddled that before. Old memories.
Yes.
I remember being in here not too long ago, and this entire area, the balcony, there were stoles hanging. And it's a memory. It's never wavered, it's never dimmed. Bruce is like that for me. He'll never waver, he'll never dim. In fact, after listening to all of you, he brightens even more, he grows even more. And I think to the time when Jesus was there with the disciples and they sit around the table from the point where we break bread and have a cup, and he looked out at them and he knew some of them were gone. And if he knew what was going to happen, if he didn't, I don't know, but he had probably a pretty good idea there was trouble ahead, and those he loved might be facing some trouble, and he loved them more. And in the church that I serve in Sayville, New York, Sayville Congregational United Church of Christ, there are two banners. One says, "Be not afraid." And the other says, "Love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might." And so when we say the prayer of Jesus that Jeannie will lead us in, I think of that Christ and that message. Be not afraid. I am with you. You are not alone. And so with the prayers in your heart today that you bring with you for Bruce, for his family, for his friends, and for the prayers of life that we carry with us, please know that God hears, just as Jesus heard always when he led the disciples in prayer.
Will you pray with me? Eternal Spirit, Earth Maker, Pain Bearer, Life Giver, Source of all that is and that shall be, Parent, Guardian, Guide of us all, Loving God, in whom is heaven, the hallowing of your name echo through the universe. The way of your justice be followed by the peoples of the world. Your heavenly will be done by all created beings. Your commonwealth of peace and freedom sustain our hope and come on earth. With the bread we need for today, feed us. In the hurts we absorb from one another, forgive us. In the times of temptation and test, strengthen us. From trials too great to endure, spare us. From the grip of all that is evil, free us. For you reign in the glory of the power that is love, now and forever. Amen. I wanted to say that Jim Tiefenthal called Ray and told him that that Bruce was getting close, and Bruce was going to come. Ray was going to come and be with him, and he said he felt in the early morning that he must come right away. And when he came there, he did something very wonderful for Sylvia Thorson Smith, Lisa, and myself. He called us, and we each were able, before he died that night, that we were each able to say goodbye and to thank him. So what an incredible thing that was for all of us to be able to do that. For the prayer of commendation, already resurrected into your eternal embrace, we commend our friend and loved one, your faithful and courageous servant, the Reverend Bruce E. Billman. We ask that you receive our gay sibling and his beacon of light into your light. Into your great mystery, we release Bruce, the one you created to be boundary breaker, and justice maker, and yes, love maker, especially this. Sent to touch others with your kindness and love in his exceptional way. Gracious, embracing God, it is with gratitude and a reluctance to say goodbye that we echo a resounding joy for his return home. We lift up Bruce, our rascally loved one, to you. May you send him into this world again in the ways you will, and may we follow this love of you with a heart such as his. Amen.
Please be seated. Jesus said, "My peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, give I unto you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Friends, believe this gospel and live in peace. And as you go, may the grace of Christ attend you, the love of God surround you, the Holy Spirit keep you, that you may live in faith, abound in hope, and grow in love, both now and forevermore. And let all God's children, wherever they may be, say, Amen.
Darken up the skyway, there's a rainbow highway to be found, leading from your window pane to a place behind the sun. Just a step beyond the rain. Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I've heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true. Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where troubles melt like lemon drops away upon the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me, somewhere over the rainbow. Bluebirds fly, birds fly over the rainbow. Why then, oh why can't I? If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh why can't I?
Here's what we know. Because Bruce has gone before us to that place where only love remains. the universe is just a little more full of something fabulous. And it's not easy in this time to figure out how to greet one another. And we know that there are some who are taking part in this service who aren't even in this space with us. So how to share this peace with one another. But here's what we do. We're just going to reach down to find that part of us that is fabulous. And then we're going to turn to one another and we're going to say, peace be with you. Peace be with you, beloved friends.